When we started writing our thoughts down on paper, it opened up endless possibilities. Ideas could grow beyond the borders of the mind, and it changed the world. Somewhere along the way, we lost touch with paper, distracted by devices made for every purpose except for thinking and focus. On edge, waiting for the next notification. But what if new technology didn't pull us away from paper, but brought us closer to it? Listen. That's not paper. It's the sound of the new Remarkable Paper Pro, rewriting the future. A paper tablet with a true color ink display, gentle reading light, and unheard of tactility. With digital features for taking notes, thinking, and organizing, without any distractions. Paper is about to change the world again. Get your paper tablet at remarkable.com today.
Stop letting the summer heat make you miserable at home. The revolutionary portable AC unit from nomorehot.com gives you instant cooling anywhere without the huge electricity bills. Whether it's your hot bedroom or stuffy living room, this portable cooling device from nomorehot.com is a must, unless you love sweating all summer long. Visit nomorehot.com and save 50% on your purchase of the #1 portable cooling device in the United States today. That's nomorehot.com.
Some crimes are so heartbreaking or shocking, they change laws, change society, or even earn the label crime of the century. But the stories that made headlines in decades past aren't necessarily remembered today. I'm Amber Hunt, a journalist and author, and in each episode of this show, I'll examine a case that's maybe lesser known today, but was huge when it happened. This is Crimes of the Centuries. In January 1909, two men who had fled to London from Latvia, then part of the Russian Empire, decided to rob a rubber factory. They weren't stealing rubber, of course, but rather wages. One of the men, Paul Heffeld, had briefly worked at the Schnurman's rubber factory in Tottenham and knew the Saturday bank run well. So he knew that a chauffeured car would arrive January 23rd with a canvas bag full of money, totaling what sounds like a fairly modest haul of 80 pounds, but in today's money, that's about 12,000 pounds, or nearly $16,000. Heffeld recruited the help of Jacob Lepidus, a man a bit older than he was, who was a bit of a political activist. They cornered the chauffeured car, out from which stepped a young office worker. The robbers brandished semi-automatic guns that even the London police didn't have access to at the time and got away with the canvas bag full of money. Funny thing about that bag, though, it was super heavy. The bank at the time didn't issue paper bills, so the whole thing was in coins, and it weighed a good 22 pounds, which sure isn't an impossible weight by any means. Parents easily carry that much on their hips when they have toddlers in tow. But the men were soon being pursued by literally hundreds of cops on top of hundreds of civilians, and as the foot chase lasted a couple of hours over some 6 miles, the bag was something of an albatross. Parts of this attempt at a getaway were straight up farcical, with the robbers casually walking at some points, listlessly firing shots over their shoulders to dissuade the mushroom of people tailing them from getting too close. They briefly hijacked a tram. At another point, they stole a horse-drawn milk cart, but it wasn't built for speed, so when they cornered too fast, the whole thing toppled over. After that, they stole a vegetable cart. But the scene wasn't funny overall at all, because at least 20 of the robbers' bullets hit humans. One fatal victim was a 10-year-old boy, Ralph Jocelyn, who'd been out earning a little money helping a baker deliver his goods. His poor family didn't have any clue he had been hurt until hours after it happened. Another victim was a police officer who was unarmed when he approached the robbers as they crossed a field. PC William Tyler told the men to give it up. They weren't going to get away with the money. He died before he could learn he was right. Both men were cornered, and both ultimately died of self-inflicted gunshot wounds. Strangely, most of the money stolen was never recovered, however. Some reports at the time suggested that maybe the robbers had an accomplice along the getaway route, but it wasn't a well-thought-out route to begin with, so that seems unlikely. More likely is a story that arose decades later about a kid finding a bag of coins in a marsh and, not realizing their value because it was just a kid, treated them like skipping stones in a nearby river. Anyway, mystery of the money aside, this strange robbery gone wrong was a turning point in British history. King Edward VII sent his condolences, while his secretary said the incident, dubbed the Tottenham outrage in the press, was almost inconceivable. Hundreds of thousands of people attended Tyler's funeral. Newspapers said he and little Ralph had been, quote, murdered by two aliens, end quote. Hefeld and Lepidus were quietly buried in unconsecrated portions of nearby cemeteries. But this incident isn't what today's episode is about. Not exactly. It merely sets the stage for what happened next, because things don't happen in a vacuum. The Tottenham outrage fueled anti-Semitism and anti-immigrant sentiment in England, which in turn fueled political activism among religiously persecuted exiles that culminated in two more outbreaks of violence a year after this one. What impatient and impulsive radicals did in late 1910 and early 1911 would shock the city, leave 3 more London policemen dead, lay waste to part of a city block, dramatically change law enforcement in Britain, usher in an astonishing new era of filmed press coverage of live events, and show us all that even small things have the ability to alter the history of the world. Crimes of the Centuries is sponsored by Cornbread. I love cornbread so much, I just gave it to my Grab Bag collab partner Amanda Rossman as a birthday gift.
It's one of my favorite products, not gonna lie.
Yep, I love the gummies, and I really love Cornbread Hemp's new THC seltzers, which let you have a great time with friends without the booze or the bad decisions.
We've tried a few THC seltzers, and I'm not exaggerating when I say Cornbread is our favorite. The flavors are delicious, there's no hangover. I am a convert.
I am too. These taste amazing and make you feel just as good. I haven't had a flavor I don't like, but the Blueberry Breeze might be my favorite.
Ooh, I think mine might be salted watermelon.
Yeah, that's a good one too.
Cornbread seltzers are made with pure THC and all natural ingredients, no synthetics, and they only have 30 calories and 5 grams of sugar per can.
Each can has 5 milligrams of THC, which is the ideal amount so you don't feel couch-locked or paranoid. It's just perfect for unwinding and kicking back.
Right now, Crimes of the Centuries listeners can save 30% on their first order and enjoy free shipping on orders over $75.
Head to cornbreadhemp.com/COTC and use code COTC at checkout. That's cornbreadhemp.com/COTC and use code COTC. Cornbread Hemp, this is the good life.
So good.
If you know Jack the Ripper, you already know a bit about the East End of London and those who lived there in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. For the most part, they had recently immigrated to England, were crushingly poor and, if employed, paid badly for hard and long work. Housed several to a room, many had left behind their homelands and dreamed of better lives under better circumstances. Those dreams were not necessarily tied to what Britain had been doing for centuries. Instead, those dreams involved a different kind of social structure, one that was not run by capitalistic elites or ruled over by autocrats or monarchs, but one which, for lack of a better word, called for anarchy. Anarchy, in this time and in this context at least, as Ishan Tharoor wrote in Time magazine in December 2010, was a social order first described and championed by Pierre-Joseph Proudhon of France. I know, anarchy has existed since the dawn of man, but this was a more well-defined set of principles. In the mid-19th century, Proudhon advocated for mutualism, an economic practice that disincentivized profit, and argued far ahead of his time for banks with free credit and unions to protect labor. The forward-thinking Frenchmen did not trust the state or the electoral process. To put it simply, cooperation was good. Competition, not so much. The rich were not your friends, and it would be best if we leveled all the playing fields. His ideas particularly resonated in Europe and Russia, where hopes for some kind of democracy had begun to grow. Those hopes had been met with terror campaigns to silence the impulse. Russian leaders had been particularly hard on their satellite countries, Latvia and Poland, and, tired of unrest, began a full-on eradication program that would have made Hitler proud. The targets were mostly Jewish. Those exiles ran for their lives. But as the 20th century was just getting going, the radicalized were getting tired of waiting for the revolution. If people had to die, so be it. So it was that, in 1910, 1 year after the Tottenham outrage, the anarchist club on Jubilee Streets became a social gathering spot where like-minded rebels could plot intricate plans for political upheavals, while others in the club drank tea and played chess and dabbled in what-ifs. This happened in the heart of Whitechapel, where the Ripper murders had occurred just 2 decades earlier. The location matters because, as historian Ben Johnson wrote on historicuk.com, quote, "Nowhere in the world is as famous for its murders as the East End of London," end quote. But first, let's go back just a few years to the 1905 Latvian Revolution. This was part of the broader Russian Revolution that year, all of which was driven by a combo of political oppression and economic hardship, among other issues. I mean, when people opt to revolt, when they decide things are bad enough that it's worth risking their lives to fight the powers that be, it's never a simple issue. There are whole college courses and books on this very topic for a reason, so I won't be able to simplify it to make any historian happy. But the gist is that people in Latvia felt oppressed, not just by the Russian czars, but also by the Baltic Germans, who had instituted a feudal system with themselves at the top. Latvian speakers were largely poor and landless, but they were also pretty well educated, and some 90% of Latvians could read at the turn of the century. That led to big ideas, including the notion that Latvia should be a free state. It's also tougher to keep down uneducated people. That's why dictators and autocrats attack institutions of higher learning as a matter of course. But the revolt, which had given the Lets, as they were called back then, hope for independence, was suppressed by the Tsar. That sent some of those seeking escape from repression and persecution to flee to London to escape execution. Donald Rumbelow, author of the Houndsditch Murders, writes that, quote, "For many of the escapees, London was simply a staging post to somewhere else. For others, Britain's toleration of political exiles, together with its proximity to Europe and the sea routes to the Baltic ports, made it a convenient place from which to continue the struggle for revolution," end quote. The most famous of these exiles was a guy everyone called Peter the Painter, likely a desperado who had already organized and staged plenty of havoc in the 1905 revolt. Once in London, they sought a great quantity of arms, something they were actively expropriating, which is a nice word for stealing, but not for their own personal gain. When they expropriated in Russia, it was a defiant, let the Tsar pay for his own undoing kind of thing. The rebels liquidated their expropriated goods and sold them to buy arms. Those were shipped east. A small note before we go further, several scholars and historians have tried to pin down the true identities of those involved in this one Latvian gang event. I'll use the names that they seem to agree upon. But it's a tricky and sticky wicket because not only did they use multiple names, but the spellings of each of their aliases vary too. Like, one co-conspirator was called Karl Hoffman, but he also went by a bunch of other names, had a different one on his passport, and went by an alias that was also used by his friend Fritz Vars. Karl Hoffman's real name was Alfred Zirkel, which was later anglicized to Driscoll. I'm hard-pressed on what to call Karl or Alfred, so I'm picking names and I'm sticking my landing, and I'm also begging forgiveness on pronunciation. Now back to the who's who on this caper. Peter the Painter was a rather shadowy figure, a working sailor who moved easily in and out of European capitals and ports, all while doing his clandestine best for the cause. In late 1910, he lodged in Whitechapel. Charles Perlman, a man who claimed he had his own revolutionary past, was his landlord. Also lodging with Perlman was Williams, aka Joseph Sokolow. By profession, he was a watchmaker. Also paying rent at Perlman's were old friends Fritz Vars and George Gardstein. Gardstein, wanted for robberies in Germany, was, according to Rumbelow, a man who, quote, could pull together people of different political persuasions and beliefs and get them to work together in a common enterprise, end quote. He and Svars had also been rescued together from secret police headquarters a few years earlier, so they had a history. And depending on whom you ask, either Peter the Painter or Gardstein was the brains behind what happened in late 1910 when a handful of their friends, 3 locksmiths and 2 young women, plotted to rob Henry Samuel Harris, a new branch of a long-established jewelry shop. Sokolow had once worked for a jeweler in Houndsditch, a West End neighborhood in the city of London. He heard the new place had a reputation for dealing with the very wealthy. In fact, there were rumors that the place was in possession of some of the Russian Tsar's crown jewels. This new jeweler was located at 119 Houndsditch, which backed on to the exchange buildings. The robbers' plan was simple: rent out the properties behind the shop and tunnel their way in through an adjoining wall. Sokolow brought in Max Smoller, who, under the name Joe Levi, did the house hunting. The preferred home, number 10 Exchange Buildings, the one directly behind the jewelers, was not available, so the gang paid 10 shillings to rent number 9 and number 11 and would make do. And the days before the robbery, which was planned for December 16th, 1910, the gang members brought in oxygen cylinders and heavy equipment to bore through the walls to enter the shop and then break into its safe. The whole operation, apart from the preparatory stowing of stuff, was supposed to last a day and a half at most. The shop, they figured, would be full of Christmas stock as the Jewish residents, mostly devout, were away as it was the eve of the Jewish Sabbath. They began around 7 p.m. that Friday night. They had not counted on the noise such an operation would create, from a documentary by Dark Sleuth Secrets.
Max Weil ran an import business. On the evening of December 16, 1910, Weil arrived at his premises to find his sister and their housemaid visibly distressed. They reported hearing strange noises coming from the jeweler's shop next door at number 119, suggesting that someone was attempting to break in through the back of the building. Number 119 backed onto a tenement at 11 Exchange Buildings, a location that provided easy access to the rear of the jeweler's shop. Concerned about a possible burglary in progress, Weil decided to alert the authorities.
3 hours into their drilling and scraping, the gang were not aware that the police at Bishopsgate Station were being alerted to their clever heist plan. Weil and Constable Walter Piper went back to investigate further. Once there, Weil and Piper agreed it sounded like persistent grinding. Piper walked around the corner, knocked on some doors until he got to number 12, where a man answered. The young cop was immediately suspicious and asked if the missus was in. He got a no and left. Then he saw a few men who appeared to be lookouts at the corners of the streets. On his way back to the station to wrangle a few extra men, Piper met up with beat cops Walter Choate and Ernest Woodhams. The latter pair walked to the Exchange Buildings, and Piper went to get further instruction. Before he could do that, though, he ran into his duty sergeant, Robert Bentley, and 2 other plainclothes cops, James Martin and Arthur Strongman. Strongman was sent to call the shop proprietor to come back to open up. The scene outside the shop was getting busy now. The hammering had alerted more than a few neighbors, and the police officers now numbered half a dozen. In quick succession, officers were placed where any escape would be seen, and Bentley went to knock at number 11. Gardstein opened the door slightly and pretended not to understand what Bentley was asking. "Have you been working or knocking about inside? Do you understand English? Do you have anyone in the house who does?" Bentley pushed inside and asked if anyone was working there. Someone on the darkened stairs pointed at a door, which opened, and two men, one inside and the other on the stairs, opened fire, hitting Bentley once in the shoulder and again in his neck. A police sergeant named Bryant, his first name seems to be lost to history, was the second officer through, and he, too, took bullets to the arm and chest. Constable Woodhams was hit in the thigh. Now, Constable Strongman and Sergeant Charles Tucker saw the men holding the pistol and, unarmed, could hardly respond in kind. Tucker was shot in the hip and heart, dying instantly. Officers ran to take cover and protect the people who were standing on their doorsteps watching. The people in the house tried to rush outside, but Gardstein was caught by Choate, and the two men wrestled for Gardstein's gun. Gang members turned to help their cohort and pumped 5 bullets into Choate, but in the process, Gardstein was hit in the back. The house's confusing layout, with stairs and doors hiding the Latvians, added to the chaos and vulnerability of the police on scene. The whole thing had taken only minutes, enough time for Gardstein to be dragged from the scene away in the night. 2 City of London police officers, Choate and Tucker, were dead. Another, Bentley, was dying, and Bryant and Woodhams were in critical condition. If this took place in modern-day America, it would be big news, but not unprecedented. In London, in 1910, when the London police were rarely armed except for a large truncheon at their side, this was seen as unfathomable brutality. Limited communication between police precincts also meant that alerting other stations about the shooters or instigating any real search for them was woefully delayed and ineffective. The immediate concern was handling the wounded, comforting the dying, rounding up witnesses, and processing one of the worst days in London police history. Crimes of the Centuries is sponsored by ButcherBox. Scott, how many times a week would you say we hit dinner time and draw a complete blank on what we should eat?
Like, at least every other night.
Right? Well, no more, thanks to ButcherBox. ButcherBox delivers top-quality, responsibly sourced proteins right to your door. We're talking better meat and seafood, including 100% grass-fed beef, free-range organic chicken, crate-free raised pork, and wild-caught seafood. And see this part?
It says no antibiotics or added hormones ever.
I am so excited for this. We're about to get our first delivery, and it feels like a whole world of new options is opening up for us. You know why?
I'm assuming because the food sounds delicious, but you're pointing to more ad copy, so let's see. As a certified B Corp, ButcherBox is committed to high standards, from how the animals are raised to how their team supports workers and reduces environmental impact. Ooh, I like the sound of that.
Right now, ButcherBox is offering our listeners $20 off their first box and free protein for a year. Go to butcherbox.com/COTC to get this limited time offer and free shipping always.
That's butcherbox.com/COTC.
Don't forget to use our link so they know we sent you.
When we started writing our thoughts down on paper, it opened up endless possibilities. Ideas could grow beyond the borders of the mind, and it changed the world. Somewhere along the way, we lost touch with paper, distracted by devices made for every purpose except for thinking and focus. On edge, waiting for the next notification. But what if new technology didn't pull us away from paper, but brought us closer to it? Listen. That's not paper. It's the sound of the new Remarkable Paper Pro, rewriting the future. A paper tablet with a true color ink display, gentle reading light, and unheard of tactility. With digital features for taking notes, thinking, and organizing, without any distractions. Paper is about to change the world again. Get your paper tablet at remarkable.com today.
As the Latvians escaped the attempted robbery at the Houndsditch jeweler, Jorka Dubov and Jakob Peters managed to carry the wounded Gardstein out of the sight of police. They argued about whether to leave him in the street or take him back to his own bed to die. They chose the latter. There, they removed his boots and slipped a semi-automatic Dresa revolver under his mattress. Sarah Trzecianski, a fragile woman who'd attached herself to Fritz Svar's girlfriend, Luba Milstein, was enlisted to find a doctor. Dr. John Scanlon arrived, but there was little he could do. He told Gardstein he needed to go to a hospital immediately. Gardstein declined. In an abundance of caution and likely fear, Scanlon waited until midday on the 17th to report, as required by law, that he had treated a man with a gunshot the previous night. The police told him to go back to see the wounded man, who was still unidentified, and they would follow to arrest him. Scanlon found the man already dead, with Sarah throwing his papers into the room's fireplace. Scanlon called the coroner. The press nearly beat the cops to the flat. The remaining papers found there indicated Gardstein was part of a group that called itself Liesma, a word that translates into flame in English. There was enough evidence there to link him to the killings, but who was he? To find out, the police took a portrait of the dead man and circulated it widely in the area as, quote, portrait and description of the dead murderer, end quote. The hunt for the gang of police assassins took most of London's police force, both City of London and the Metropolitan Police, to every known address, led them through the East End to the Anarchist Club, following every lead and employing every informer possible. On December 23rd, the 3 murdered policemen were buried with hordes of Londoners looking on. In attendance at St. Paul Cathedral was British Home Secretary Winston Churchill and his wife, Clementine, London's Lord Mayor, and the city's sheriff and alderman. Before Christmas, the police had 5 prisoners in custody, with an eyewitness identifying Yorka Dubov and Jakob Peters as the men who had carried their mortally wounded comrade from the scene. Gardstein's landlord recognized him when he saw the poster. He said the dead man had lodged at 44 Gold Street. There, police found bomb-making materials, stacks of ammunition, anarchist literature, and an unknown quantity of acids and poisons. On New Year's Day, a new informant came to the city police headquarters and said that Fritz Svars and the man he knew as Joseph, it was William Sokoloff, were hiding in Stepney at 100 Sidney Street. While the identity of the informer has never been verified, he was most likely Charles Perlman, who had been welcomed into the Sidney Street hiding spot on at least one occasion. His motive for informing remains unclear. Police watched the Sidney Street address throughout the next day. The informer
also warned the authorities that the men were armed with Mauser pistols, adding urgency to the police efforts to capture the fugitives before they could strike again. This information set the stage for one of the most dramatic confrontations in London's history, the siege of Sidney Street. The officers had been given no details about their mission, only that it was dangerous. The gravity of the situation was clear, as only unmarried men were chosen for this operation.
By the end of the day on January 2nd, fearing that the 2 suspects were on the move, the police decided it was time to act. Detective Inspector Frederick Wensley figured they were going to need additional men from other divisions to pull off this raid. This time, though, they'd bring guns. Trouble with that, of course, was that the guns they had were what some would have called antiquated Morris tube rifles. They were not semi-automatic Mausers or Dresas with 7-shot detachable single-stack magazines. You know, the kind the bad guys had. The Sidney Street block was made up of 10 4-story houses built just 10 years earlier. They were, as Rumbelow described them, quote, bigger than the usual gray 2-story houses in the area, but they had facings of red brick and were grandiloquently known after the landlord as Charlie Martin's Mansions, end quote. Just after midnight on January 3rd, 2 London stations had amassed 200 men and were being told where to deploy. Others were moving stealthily through the street to evacuate the residents around number 100, placing themselves at specific locations to make sure the bunch inside there couldn't escape. Tiny aside, in later books and published reports, the number of police on the scene would swell to 700, even 1,000. The same time reporting never exceeded 200. Back to Sidney Street, where no one in charge was certain that the 2 gunmen were actually in there. They forged ahead. By 2 a.m. that early January 3rd, 100 Sidney Street was isolated, cut off. There were snipers inside people's homes, their outdated guns aimed out curtained windows. It was decided that the cover of darkness did not serve police purposes. They would wait until daybreak to rush the house. Around 7 a.m., a brave police sergeant ran across Sidney Street to knock loudly on the door, which was partially open. Nothing. Then, Wensley ordered his men to throw rocks at the upstairs windows. The glass on the windows broke, but nothing. Next, someone threw a brick through a window. Finally, something. Coming from within the house, shots rained down on the gathered men below. Now, legally, the police could fire back as they had not fired the first shots. A dramatic reading of the news reports at the time, again from Dark Sleuth Secrets.
Attention, citizens. We bring to you a report most extraordinary and alarming from the streets of our very own metropolis. Sidney Street, Stepney, has become the battleground for anarchy and the rule of law. In the dead of night past, a cabal of foreign revolutionaries laid siege to the sanctity of commerce and peace. The Houndsditch heist, orchestrated by the now-deceased desperado George Gardstein, has escalated into an outright war in our streets, claiming the lives of 3 of Scotland Yard's finest. Our constabulary hunted down these brigands, only to find the serpent's tail at Sidney Street.
The neighbors began to gather to watch as best they could from safe positions along the street. A sergeant was hit, but not gravely. Sleet was falling. Gunfire was steady. An hour passed. The police were making no progress. After a failed try, Wensley got through to Scotland Yard by phone and requested authority to bring in troops from the Tower of London. The man he spoke with had no such authority, saying he'd have to call the Home Secretary to advise. Churchill, who had been in his bath at the time he got the call, okayed it immediately. Here's Andrew Whitehead reading from his book, A Devilish Kind of Courage, Anarchists, Aliens, and the Siege of Sidney Street.
Rifle-bearing Scots Guards made their way from the Tower of London and took up positions prone on the street on either flank of the besieged building, in a requisitioned house opposite, and in the towering bottling plant of a nearby brewery.
Churchill stewed all morning about whether to go down and see for himself. Later, he'd remark, quote, that convictions of duty were supported by a strong sense of curiosity, which perhaps it would have been well to keep in check, end quote. But he was not that guy. The question was just when he would go. It took almost no time for the Scots Guards, 20 highly trained members of the British Army, including officers, to report for duty, fully armed with long rifles. By 10 a.m., a few were in place in a brewery that overlooked the back of 100 Sidney Street. They could see into the attic and windows. They began to heavily shell the back of the top floors, forcing the Latvians to the first floor, where they were now being relentlessly fired at by guards who had taken position where the police had previously proved ineffective. More police arrived as the morning wore on. They were slightly better armed than the police had been before, as shotguns had been rounded up for use. The fresh officers were those who had had military experience. The press had been there almost the entire day. So, too, the first motion picture cameras to film a live firefight. Philip Gibbs, reporter for the Daily Chronicle, wrote, quote, at both ends of Sidney Street, the Scots Guards were in position, taking cover behind the angle of the houses. Around them were groups of policemen in uniform armed with shotguns and numbers of plainclothes detectives with heavy revolvers. On the roof of a great brewery on the same side of the way as the Rising Sun Public House were scores of workpeople, and as far as the eye could see across the sloping roofs, the chimney pots and parapets, the skyline was black with heads, while in the street below, as far as a quarter of a mile away, there were vast and tumultuous crowds kept back by lines of mounted policemen. The voices of those many thousands came up to me in great murmurous gusts, like the roar of wild beasts in a jungle. It seemed as if the whole of London had poured into Whitechapel and Stepney to watch one of the most deadly and thrilling dramas that has ever happened in the great city within living memory." End quote. As the morning dragged on, there would be occasionally calls for those on the outside to cease fire. Then the street grew quiet, a silence broken by those inside the house firing a barrage as if in defiance of the order. How could this be just two guys? Around 11, according to the Daily Chronicle reporter, the fusillade from the guards intensified to be what he estimated to be thousands of rounds. The Latvians had answered in kind, proving they too had ammunition to spare. By noon, Churchill could wait no longer. He arrived in a car and, while he later admitted to having second thoughts, he could hardly leave once he arrived. He was not there, he insisted to police, to direct the assault. He merely asked them to carry on, though probably not in those words, as the team on the ground was now planning to storm the building and end this. Churchill moved to what he thought was the safety of a warehouse doorway to watch. He could tell that some of the plans being put forward were impractical, even dangerous. After all, he had served in the British Army from 1896 to 1900 and was a war correspondent in South Africa during the Boer War. He was not a novice. In fact, later that year, he'd be made First Lord of the Admiralty, the civilian head of the British Navy, helping to prepare it for the First World War. He couldn't help himself. He suggested police begin to actively search for steel plate or whatever could be used as shields as they made their approach to the house. They never had the chance. Around 1, silence descended as everyone could see that the house they were shooting at was now on fire. The smoke got thicker and the blaze slowly moved through the house, up the stairs. Had those inside decided this would be their best hope? To escape through the cover of haze and ash? The men were still visible inside. The soldiers continued their barrage. The fire brigade was called to keep the fire from spreading to other houses, other roofs. Trained to fight any fire they came across, the men had to be ordered by Churchill to not try to tame the blaze at number 100. He told them to let the house burn. A half hour later, the fire reached the attic and the roof. Then the house began to give way, falling into itself. The ceiling failed, wood splintered, adding fuel to an already raging inferno. Police later claimed they caught a fleeting glimpse of a man on a bed, his face covered with a pillow. The Scots Guards had not stopped firing on the crumbling building. The fire burned on until, around 2, detectives, with guns drawn, approached the house, kicked the door in, and received no response of any kind. The fire brigade moved in to quell the blaze. All that was left was to see what the house had buried in the rubble. Crimes of the Centuries is sponsored by Remy. My teeth are really important to me. I brush and floss religiously and really try to keep them in tip-top shape, which makes it extra annoying that I also do something in my sleep that I can't control.
You grind.
I'm not alone in that. 30% of Americans grind their teeth, and our smiles need protection. There's no better solution than Remy's custom-fit night guard.
And Remy is 80% less than the dentist and way easier. Here's how it works. Amber got her impression kit delivered straight to her door. Remy gave step-by-step instructions to get the perfect impression.
They even have you send in photos to make sure you do it right.
Then Remy sends you your custom-fit night guard.
It's made in the U.S., right in Las Vegas.
Once it arrives, you start using it to protect your teeth. I've noticed when Amber doesn't use her bite guard, she wakes up with headaches the next day.
They can be brutal. The best part about Remy is that they're so confident you'll get a perfect fit. They offer a 45-night perfect fit guarantee or your money back.
No waiting rooms, no overpriced bills, just a better way to protect your teeth while you sleep.
Try Remy risk-free at shopremy.com/COTC and use code COTC to get up to 50% off your night guard at checkout. That's 50% off at shopremi.com/COTC with code COTC.
Thank you, Remy, for sponsoring this episode.
Stop letting the summer heat make you miserable at home. The revolutionary portable AC unit from NoMoreHot.com gives you instant cooling anywhere without the huge electricity bills. Whether it's your hot bedroom or stuffy living room, this portable cooling device from nomorehot.com is a must, unless you love sweating all summer long. Visit nomorehot.com and save 50% on your purchase of the #1 portable cooling device in the United States today. That's nomorehot.com.
Inside the charred ruins of the house, police found the remains of 2 men, though they were headless and practically limbless after the fire had done its work, showering the home's debris down upon them. After much discussion, some sleuthing, and a lot of confusion, the identification of the men seemed to rely most heavily upon the evidence given by former fellow lodger at 100 Sidney Street, Betsy Gershon, to the coroner's inquest a week after the siege. She had been the mistress of William Sokoloff, whom she identified as one of the dead. Also killed was Fritz Svars. At this point, the narrative that had elapsed since the Houndsditch killings gets very complicated. Suspects galore had flitted in and out of the various residences of the known Latvian revolutionaries. Some could have fled the country after the original murders. Some could have simply gone back on the ships they were on leave from and were now at sea. But which of them had participated in the Houndsditch murders? Who were the accomplices of the 3 dead gang members who had helped the 2 Sidney Street shooters hide? Who had done what? More to the point, who was guilty of murder? Who was guilty of attempting to break and enter? Who was accessory after the fact? It was a minefield. To further complicate matters, there was Gardstein's last caregiver, Sarah Trzecianski, who was now literally insane, having sat with Gardstein as he died, repeatedly raving that she had seen his ghost and believed she would be accused of killing him. What to do with her? So when the initial hearings opened on January 23, 1911, 6 Latvians were in custody: Jakob Peters, Yorka Dubov, Osip Fedorov, dead man Fritz Svars' mistress, Luba Milstein, Sarah Trzecianski, and Karl Hoffman. The prosecutor, representing the Crown, laid out his indictments, which sought to prove that the one man had murdered the 3 policemen on December 16th, and the other 2 dead men, who died during the siege, were responsible for the death of a fireman who perished fighting the blaze. The prosecutor also wanted to indict the 2 women as accessories to all that, and to prove that the first 5 had participated in the attempted burglary of the shop, while Hoffman had helped hide the 2 men on Sidney Street. And without belaboring it, the prosecution's case was a mess from the get-go. The complexity of the case didn't help, as there were 2 crime scenes, and the defendants had moved around considerably during the time preceding the cop killings and after. Still, the prosecution did nothing to help itself. Maybe most importantly, they pinned the 3 policemen's deaths on Gardstein. Prosecutor Archibald Bodkin said during trial, quote, "Gardstein was the man who came in flinging open that back door and shot Bentley at his right front. There were also other shots from the man on the stairs. Several shots were fired at Bentley by the man Gardstein from the back. He advanced to the front door of the house. Of that there is no doubt, for we have the hand, according to evidence from Strongman, protruding from the door of number 11 so as to sweep the place, firing at Woodhams, Bryant, and Martin," end quote. Ballistics had shown that the gun that killed the men was a Dresa, the same gun found tucked in Gardner's mattress where he died. Hence, the Crown decided he was the gunman. One problem there, of course, is that the gun was placed there by Svars, who may have known he was implicating his dying compadre and shifting blame away from himself. Or, nice guy that he was, maybe he was just trying to give Gardstein a weapon should the cops come barging in. Hard to say. But even the most cursory of examinations of the statements made by those officers on the scene that day indicate that Gardstein could not have done the killing. Admittedly, it was a chaotic scene with guys, both good and bad, moving swiftly through doors, upstairs, over one another. Still, descriptions and copious restaging of the initial shootout do not shore up the theory that Gardstein was the assassin. It would be shown that Officer Choate had been shot by a Mauser, which Gardstein did carry. But the bullet from the Mauser was not the one that killed him. That one was from the same Dresa that killed Sergeant Tucker. Strongman also had referred to the gun that Gardstein was carrying as a long, thin one, which describes not a Dresa, but a Mauser. Gardstein, by the by, was shot with a Browning. Further, Gardstein, who died in his own room, which police would refer to as a bomb-making factory filled with munitions, had no ammunition that fit the Dresa by his side. The magistrate must surely have noted all of this. He may also have noted that Constable Strongman's ID of the shooter was done by means of a photograph. He did not see the dead body, nor did he describe the shooter as the same size as Gardstein. He also said he was wearing a suit. Gardstein was wearing an overcoat when he was shot. The discrepancies were never brought up or explained by the prosecution, whom we can safely say did not do the Crown proud that day. Later analysis would show that the killer of all three City of London cops was most likely Jakob Peters, who was listening to all of this from the bench at which the defendant sat. So where were we? Milstein had turned state's evidence and was allowed to go free. Trzecianski was deported because of her lunacy, as they called it. Osip Fedorov was freed because the only evidence against him was that he went to the exchange building sometime during that December interlude. Hoffman's only crime that could be proved was that he was Farr's friend. He walked as well. The indictments had dwindled. Peters and Dubov would be charged with the willful murder of Charles Tucker because they had, quote, been found armed with similar weapons to those which the murders were committed, end quote. Dubov, Peters, and underground revolutionary Nina Vasilyeva were charged with feloniously harboring a felon guilty of murder. Dubov, Peters, Rosen, and Vasilyeva were also charged with conspiring to break and enter the jewelry shop. Thus, on May 1st, 1911, Justice William Grantham, a 75-year-old judge who was known to be frequently reversed and who spoke openly about the case and defamed the defendants in the press all before it began, gavelled the court to get on with it. And yet, after the Crown had just called 2 witnesses, Grantham said he would save everyone time and rule that there wasn't enough evidence for the jury to find guilt of murder. Drop the charge, he said. The prosecutors did. Then the Crown produced 1 witness who identified the assailants as present at the exchange buildings, after which the jurors went out late at night to see if any ID could be made under limited light. The next day, Mr. Justice Grantham ruled that since no one could corroborate the previous witnesses' statements, there was no basis on which to continue the case. The conspiracy to break and enter was the only charge that remained against anyone now. The trial continued. Dozens of witnesses were called. The judge then said it was likely that all of those who had participated were now dead or couldn't be found, specifically Max Smoller and Peter the Painter. Because 2 bottles at number 11 exchange buildings had clear fingerprints on them that belonged to Nina Vasilyeva, she was found guilty of conspiracy to break and enter. The men were found not guilty. Nina was sentenced to 2 years in prison, but 5 weeks later, that was overturned because of judicial error. 3 policemen and 1 firefighter had died. 2 other policemen were so badly injured as to retire to live off a pension the rest of their lives. The East End of London had been turned upside down for months. All of Europe had read daily about the crime, the searches, the indictments, and the trial. Their reactions had been everything from amusement to admiration, according to Rumbelow. The French admired the British move to enlist troops that day. The Germans put new restrictions on immigrants. The Russians, still a nation run by the Tsar, wanted the world to wake up to the anarchist menace. And no one was held even remotely responsible. Crimes of the Centuries is sponsored by Galatea by Inkit. I love reading at night.
Me too.
My only problem is that I often tell myself, I'll just read one more chapter. But then suddenly it's 2 a.m. and you can't put the story down because you need to know how it ends. With Galatea's bingeable, can't-stop reading romance, new releases every week, I figure sleep is overrated anyway.
Galatea is a reading app where anyone craving a little me time can dive into the library that leaves you feeling recharged and fulfilled.
It's not just any library either. It's the library of romance stories. There are over 1,000 bestsellers to choose from. We're talking shifter romance, bad boy billionaires, forbidden love, slow burn fantasy, teen drama, and much, much more.
Galatea is home to original series and standalone stories with an exclusive catalog of best-selling authors. With new chapters dropping every week, there's always something new to explore. That's why over 30 million people have fallen in love with reading on Galatea.
Right now, Galatea is offering our listeners an extra 25% off of an already irresistibly affordable subscription when you go to galatea.com/COTC.
That's GALATEA.com/COTC to indulge in unlimited stories for even less.
galatea.com/COTC.
Stop letting the summer heat make you miserable at home. The revolutionary portable AC unit from NoMoreHot.com gives you instant cooling anywhere without the huge electricity bills. Whether it's your hot bedroom or stuffy living room, this portable cooling device from NoMoreHot.com is a must, unless you love sweating all summer long. Visit NoMoreHot.com and save 50% on your purchase of the #1 portable cooling device in the United States today. That's NoMoreHot.com.
Perhaps the biggest and most important thing to come from the Houndsditch murders and subsequent Sidney Street siege was the general sense of appallment in London that the good guys had been outgunned by the bad. They fixed that. London police got better guns. Winston Churchill took a beating for being rash and altogether too curious. The newsreels of the day and the newspapers later reported that he was easily in the range of gunfire emanating from the house, and it was obvious that he was not always behind cover. According to the International Churchill Society, quote, over the next several weeks after the siege, Churchill was hooted and jeered for the personal part he took in the siege. In Parliament, Arthur Balfour said, we are concerned to observe photographs in the illustrated newspapers of the Home Secretary in the danger zone. I understand what the photographer was doing, but why the Home Secretary? End quote. Churchill said he did not find those comments altogether unjust. But he was a guy who didn't flinch at battle. You know, he had wanted to accompany British troops on D-Day, but cooler heads prevailed. It did not escape later notice that should things have gone only slightly different that day, Churchill could have been shot and killed. If so, the man most likely to have been prime minister during the Second World War would have been Balfour, a man much more inclined to deal or surrender than fight. No one in the Western world would have considered that anything but disastrous. The siege was also heralded as the beginning of live news coverage prepped for the masses. According to the Bioscope, the January 3rd police action brought 5 film companies to a part of London that had, heretofore, been invisible to the outside world. 3 of the 5 newsreels still exist and can be found online. Not as easily found, then or now, was/is Peter the Painter. Who was he and where did he go? And was he, in fact, in charge of the Houndsditch operation, taking, as some believe, his orders directly from Vladimir Lenin? Andrew Whitehead again.
Peter the Painter is the name indelibly associated with this spate of armed crime, or what those irresponsible might have regarded as revolutionary expropriation. In fact, he was not at the site of any of the shootings. By the time of the siege of Sidney Street, he had fled across the North Sea. But he is not an invention, as some have sometimes suggested. He had been prominent in the Latvian Revolution of 1905 and in the rearguard action against a vicious counter-revolution inflicted by the imperial power that then ruled the Baltic states, Russia. Peter the Painter was one of the leading militants in that uprising, organising armed resistance and staging ambushes, jailbreaks, robberies and assassinations. To some, he was a revolutionary hero. Others regarded him as a pistol-toting desperado.
His real name might have been Janusz Jacoli. He was, according to Philip Ruff, who spent 20 years studying the siege of Sidney Street, Not just the most famous Latvian in London, but for 70 years, the most wanted man in Great Britain. Or maybe it was Peter Pietkopf, argues author Rumbelow, a man who fled England to later become the founder of the Chechka, the first Russian secret police, just after the 1917 Russian Revolution. As such, he would have directed mass arrests, torture, and executions of all those who were considered enemies of Bolshevism. He was, then, as the story goes, similarly executed by Joseph Stalin during his purges during the 1930s. Rumbelow is, quote, absolutely convinced that it was Peter who was the main shooter and the murderer of the 3 policemen, end quote. Now that's a tad too convenient for Ruff, author of Towering Flame, The Life and Times of the Elusive Latvian Anarchist Peter the Painter. According to a Latvian news site, Ruff frames Peter as a man named Gedera Elias, an ardent Latvian anarchist who spoke 6 languages and led rebel attacks during the 1905 revolution. There is no evidence, he says, that Peter was on Sidney Street that day, though it is known he fled to Finland, the US, and Britain after the Tsar crushed the uprising. Ruff believes that he was able to make his final home in Australia as an obscure farmer. In any case, in 1911, a reward of £500 was offered for information which led to Peter the Painter's arrest, but that might have been wishful thinking. That's because there would have been very little the British could do to require any other country to turn him over, as they had no hard evidence that he was either the mastermind or the killer of the 3 policemen. You should know there are historians today who believe he never existed. Pretty amazing if so, because he is remembered. During later scuffles, big and small, the German Mauser, a weapon used during the Sidney siege, would be referred to as Peter the Painter. In 2008, 2 blocks on London's Sidney Street were renamed. One was named Peter House, the other Painter House. To say the London police were unhappy about that is an understatement. To research this case, journalist Amy Wilson read The Houndsditch Murders in the Siege of Sidney Street by Donald Rumbelow. She read excerpts from Philip Ruff's work on Peter the Painter and reporter Philip Gibbs' Adventures in Journalism. Amber read Andrew Whitehead's A Devilish Kind of Courage, Anarchist Aliens in the Siege of Sidney Street. Amy had to do a bit of self-education on the Latvian Revolution, thanks Google, and on the siege, which was also called in the literature the Battle of Stepney. She had to make a chart to keep all the ne'er-do-wells straight. Crimes of the Centuries is available early and ad-free through Grab Bag Collab. Join us at patreon.com/GrabBagCollab to hear not just exclusive content related to this show, but to also get access to several other shows on our profit-sharing network. Unless noted in the citations, this show was researched and written by me, Amber Hunt, and produced by Amanda Rossman and Henry Lavoie. Original music is by Bruce Hunt, Andrew Higley, and occasionally by my son, Hunt Van Benskoten. Other music comes from Soundstripe and Epidemic Sound. If you like the show, help us out by rating and reviewing us on Apple Podcasts. For more information or to recommend a case, go to centuriespod.com.